The other day, for his birthday, my best friend invited me and a few of his friends. The night went normal, we played some games, of course we ate and sang happy birthday, and when people started to go to their homes, there was like 5 of us remaining. Since we already did all of the activities that we could think of, we decided that we were gonna watch a movie. And since almost most of the times that we go to his house we watch a horror movie, this wasn't the exception. One of them suggested that we watch an ancient movie called Incantation, a psychological horror movie that follows a mother while she tries to get rid of a curse that she unknowingly passed to her daughter. The movie was nothing like your usual horror movie, it was terrifying. The movie encouraged the audience to play along with the protagonist's paranoia and fear, with imagery and symbols that use visual illusions to keep them stuck in your mind for a while, and building up the tension of seeing the big monster at the end of the movie. All of us that we finished watching the movie, we were scared to say the least. In my case, I haven't felt this terror and distrust of my own space since I watched the Mandela Catalog, the first volume, in 2022, and I can assure you this time it was way more terrifying than it was before. It's funny that I do not have a serious intro yet, so every time that I try to cover sort of like a serious topic like this, I don't know if this is serious or not, but it's more serious, way more serious than the previous videos. It's quite curious that I do not have a serious intro yet. How funny. The word horror describes an intense feeling of fear, shock, and or disgust. But what if we take this concept into a more psychological approach? Psychological horror is a subgenre of horror that focuses on mental, emotional, and physiological states to frighten, disturb, and or unsettle the audience. I already mentioned an example of psychological horror. The movie that I mentioned relies heavily on psychological horror and messing up with the audience's mind. And that's one of the biggest characteristics of psychological horror, but we will be talking about that right in a moment. Another characteristic thing about psychological horror is that it differs a lot from the traditional horror. Psychological horror aims to create discomfort in the audience through the environment. It uses music, sounds, fears, and phobias, giving the audience a false sense of threat. The two most noticeable differences between psychological horror and the classic horror. One of the biggest differences is that it doesn't rely on gore and blood and jump scares like your typical horror media. Sometimes it uses, but barely, and sometimes it doesn't even use any of these elements. And the other biggest difference is that it balances the experience and feelings of paranoia, unsettling imagery, and psychological state of the human being, reinforcing what I just said, that it mostly plays with your mind. The main characteristics of psychological horror are the following: subjective reality. Characters tend to experience hallucinations, delusions, and or paranoia, distorting reality for the characters and the audience. Sometimes these hallucinations can be off-camera or directed towards the audience, such as visual hallucinations. And I'm just gonna retake the example that I just mentioned of the movie that I watched, since it had a lot of visual hallucinations with flashing imagery, and those type of hallucinations that you see them and they like flash on the screen that help your eyes retain that image for like 5 or 10 seconds after the image disappears. Emotional vulnerability. Characters tend to be isolated emotionally and or physically. Characters could be trapped or cut off from the world. Sometimes they're the ones that mentally isolate themselves. For example, a character that suffers from a mental disorder that doesn't allow them to fully interact with the world. Tension and ambience building. The story slowly builds tension between the audience and what's going on with the story, using the atmosphere, sounds, and subtle elements to unsettle the audience. Protagonist declining mental state. Most of the times, characters could be haunted by their past self, their past being, their past traumas, their past actions, their past memories that are likely repressed, and or moral dilemmas from the past. Most of the cases, this leads to the character's mental state decline. It also experiences themes of identity loss, the fear of falling into insanity, or the meaningless of our existence, leading to the existential and psychological terror of the human race's existence. And the last characteristic is the minimal or subtle use of the supernatural elements. Supernatural elements, we all know that in classical horror it's always present. In the case of psychological horror, supernatural elements, if present, tend to be ambiguous, leaving the audience with the doubt if it's real, the character's imagination, or just the audience's speculation. creating that fear and tension of the unknown. Psychological horror has a lot of products in the media, and I'm going to be talking about some of them and why they work so perfectly. A movie that I already mentioned a lot of times, the movie that I watched, that's called Incantation. The movie follows a mother trying to get rid of a curse that she unknowingly passed to her daughter, while also trying to overcome the trauma and mental issues that it brought to her. The movie is presented in sort of like a found footage media, more of like analog horror, that I might talk about it in the future. During these recordings, it always mentions a video that nobody could watch or they're gonna follow up with the curse. The most noticeable characteristic of psychological horror that we see in this movie is the protagonist's declining mental state, and it literally fits the explanation of the characteristic that I made before. Also, the subjective reality in this movie, where we see the daughter having sort of like hallucinations, something that we never get to fully see on the screen, the mom experiencing paranoia, the visual hallucinations that we tend to see throughout the movies, and something that's almost always present in psychological horror, the fourth wall break. Since the movie's format is 100% recordings, the main character or the main characters in general tend to ask questions to the viewer. Sometimes they speak directly to the viewer and encourage the viewers to follow what they're doing, making the audience also a key part of the movie. Being one of the most popular psychological horror games, Doki Doki Literature Club. Doki Doki Literature Club, or the DLC, is a visual novel game released by Tim Salvato. It follows the story of a high school student who is invited to join the literature club by his childhood friend Sayori. While he's in the club, he meets Natsuki, Yuri, and the club president Monika. The game works as a normal romance visual novel during Act 1, until the player reaches the preparation of the school festival event. During the preparation, the game gives us the option of helping one of the three girls, Sayori, Natsuki, or Yuri, with their respective preparations of the school festival. During this time of preparation, we have a deep talk with Sayori, and when it's time for the school festival event, we see that Sayori never arrived, and we realize that a tragedy happened to her, restarting the game. Leading to Act 2. Act 2 starts as usual but with the absence of Sayori. During the first scene, the scene where Sayori invites us, encourages us to join the literature club, the game, but since Sayori's file was deleted in the previous act. So instead, Monika is the one who asks us to join the club. We join, and unlike the previous act, things get weird, and depending on your decisions, either Natsuki or Yuri will give you a different disturbing ending for this act. After all of these uncomfortable, disturbing, and unsettling things happen during the game, Monika apologizes and deletes both Yuri and Natsuki from the game, restarting the game again. Act 3 is just us sitting in front of Monika. She explains us some stuff, like the fact that she's been self-aware that she's in a game all of the time. We talk to her, we chat with her, until the player decides to delete Monika's file. Monika realizes that we deleted her, says some stuff that nobody gives a fuck about, and the game restarts again, leading to the last act, Act 4. Act 4 is the same as Act 1, but with the absence of Monika. We meet all of the girls, but instead of being 4, there's 3, Sayori, Natsuki, and Yuri. This time Sayori is the president of the literature club. After we meet all of the girls, Sayori starts acting weird, having a similar behavior to Monika in the previous acts. Seeing that, Monika intervenes and deletes the whole game once and for all, giving us the canon ending of the game. You can have other endings that we will not be talking about this today. If you want to see a video about Doki Doki Literature Club, you can leave it in the comments. But let's continue. Some of the aspects that give Doki Doki Literature Club this creepiness, this psychological horror tag, it has disturbing elements and sensitive topics, such as suicide, self-harm, depression, implied child abuse, and graphic imagery. The game doesn't have a protagonist itself, but instead all of the characters in-game are like the protagonist or the main characters. But we can clearly see all of the characters having a declining mental state. The game can also give the player a feeling of guilt, depending on the character that you like the most throughout the game. Implied blame that the game gives to the player for their decisions that most of the time they couldn't control. And the biggest element, the most disturbing element in this game, is the fourth wall break. Most of the times we get to see Monika talking directly to the player, the fact that Monika plays with the game files in your computer, and a lot of other fourth wall breaks that we see in-game. The last piece of media that I'm going to be talking about is Everywhere at the End of Time. Everywhere at the End of Time is a series of musical albums created by the English musician known as The Caretaker, releasing its 6 stages from 2016 to 2019. Everywhere at the End of Time can be summarized as, while doing my investigation I found this Reddit page in one sentence describes perfectly the album, a horrifying musical portrayal of what it feels like to undergo dementia. Everywhere at the End of Time was made with the purpose of making a musical representation of dementia. During 6 stages, 6 albums, we follow a person's slow descent into dementia, while they lose the ability to remember, recognize, and express their identity. Stage 1 is the clearest stage out of all, and the most beautiful stage. It represents the second stage of dementia, being an introduction of the disease. It also shows the first signs of memory loss. And from the first stage, it comes one of the most popular, sort of like creepypasta songs that people have used, as I mentioned, in creepypasta or in general in horror stories. The second stage starts getting more distorted, having more melancholic or sadder tones. It represents the awareness of something being wrong and refusing to accept it. Stage 3 represents the early signs of confusion. Music starts getting less coherent, with more noticeable white noise, distance cuts, and more reverb than before, being the last coherent memories before everything goes downhill. Stage 4 represents post-consciousness, introducing fragmentation and tangles of memories. Melodies change abruptly and music is very distorted. In stage 5, repetition is key. It has enormous distortions and it has the last few coherent memories. In stage 6, there's no sense of coherence anymore. White noise and incoherent sounds prevail, just emptiness, being the last stage/album of the project. I already mentioned it, but I think that it's worth mentioning this again. Everywhere at the End of Time is a horrifying musical portrayal for what it is like to undergo dementia. While investigating online, you can see that most of the people who listen to this album completely, they tend to express that this musical piece left them with a really uncomfortable feeling, an undescribable feeling, and in general a very odd, unsettling, and disturbing feeling. Talking about this album, it's sort of like a bit hard, because most of the times it's really hard to express just how the album makes a person feel. So the best recommendation is that you go to listen to the album yourself. It shows how the person is isolated and trapped by the disease that they're suffering from. And The Caretaker did the ambience on point in this musical piece, being that most of the songs we can clearly tell that they are inspired from music from the past. There's a lot of more media representations of psychological horror. If you're interested in watching the movie, you can watch it on Netflix. It's called Incantation. If you want to play the game, I'm gonna leave the link of download in the description. And I'm also going to link down the musical piece of Everywhere at the End of Time. Before ending, I want to talk about this Forbes article that's called "A Psychologist Shares How Psychological Horror Turns Our Minds Against Us." The article starts giving us a brief summary of what psychological horror is, some of its characteristics, and the science behind psychological horror, and then it talks about one of the pioneers of analytical psychology called Carl Jung, and how he was the first one to conceptualize the archetypal shadow, stating the following. In his renowned book, The Archetypes of Collective Unconscious, he described the shadow as an unconscious aspect of our personality, containing all traits and impulses that we reject or hide from others, and even from ourselves. And then it explains that psychological horror viewers face this shadow characteristic throughout the various elements that psychological horror has, being the following: skepticism, mistrust, doubt, and paranoia. And it's the fact that these psychological horror media elements sometimes give you that feeling of uneasy in your own space, leaving the majority of its viewers with mistrust of their own space, their own ambience, even having mistrust on themselves and the others that surround them, wondering the intentions of others, leaving the viewers with that paranoia feeling, and as I already mentioned before, sort of the feeling of a false threat. Now, to finish the video, psychological horror has been in the rise in the past few years, and honestly I can't wait to see more of these products and projects in the media. Psychological horror is one of the best subgenres of horror in general. It doesn't follow the rules of the classical horror story, but instead it plays with the mind of the viewer, the player, or as we could even see in Everywhere at the End of Time, playing with the mind of the listener. If you made it this far, thank you so much. I love you for staying here. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you want to see more videos like covering any topic, you can leave it in the comments. I already have 2 videos yapping about 5 Nights at Freddy's. And I hope you're having a great day, great afternoon, great night. Again, thank you so much for watching and have a nice day.